Kept liggen, kept whipping round and wegen. Me roll around in Svenny cars, rockstar with these rocks lagen.
Today we'll be remaking the 808 and the Synth from 4 Raws by EsDeeKid. You can find a link to the free presets in the description below. The first thing that stands out to me about this track is that it's loud. If we were to stream this track with auto-normalization on, the streaming services would turn it down so much that the waveform would look like this. The track's waveform is just a solid rectangle. Zoom in and we can see that the waveform is just completely hard-clipped in order to get the song this loud. So we hear this as distortion. Usually this would be exactly what we don't want to do to our track, but it totally suits the raw, aggressive vibe of this song. What I hear on this song are 4 pretty basic elements: a vocal, a spins-style 808, a panning saw wave, and some drums. But recreating these sounds as synth presets is a lot trickier than you'd think, since so much of the vibe is coming from the post-processing that's like really extreme limiting on the master bus. But we're going to give it a shot here and try to move as much of the post-processing distortion and vibe into the presets as we can so that we can repurpose these for other songs. The first thing I'm going to do is turn the reference down just a few dB. Otherwise it's so loud that it generates these intersample peaks that are triggering my safety limiter, and we don't want to hear that during the patch match.
I'm 4 man deep in this jamming, and I'm rimming around as a baby. Plotted on chicks, gonna make the excursion. So man is this shit like I'm vegan. Went from Henny to sipping on bathing. I've switched to a different pace and cut to the chase, man, they call me the season. All over the net to my bed. I'm a scumbag, I was raised in Liverpool, slums like I was born, no joke, but a swamp.
Next, let's build a scaffolding for our synth presets to live in. Start by extracting the hi-hat and snare stem from the track. We can use Logic's stem splitter for this, but I'm sure you can find similar functions in other DAWs. The hat and snare stem has a little bleed from the 808, but that's fine. Just remove the offending hats. And replace them with cleaner hats that have no 808 bleed. Just comp in the drum fills. And now we have some context in which to build our other sounds. The 808 stem isn't usable since part of its attack has bled through to the hi-hat, so we'll have to remake the 808 ourselves, starting with this MIDI and Unisynth's init patch. Select Oscillator A's sampler engine and load 808.3. Tune the sample to C1 so that it's in the correct octave for the MIDI. Normalize the sample, and turn the amp level all the way up. Add a 1/16th note release to the amp envelope. Route the 808 directly to the FX section. Try downsampling the sample for a slightly different tone. And put the patch in mono so note tails don't overlap during the fast sections. Next, add an aggressive limiter. Set the release in time with the song. At 144 beats per minute, a 30-second note is about 52 milliseconds. I'm going to keep release super short because it distorts a little bit more, which in this case is a good thing. Let a little more attack through. And add some low-pass hard clipping. Turn auto gain off. EQ out some low mids and boost some of the boxy mid-range around 600 Hz. It sounds to me like there might be a separate kick in this track, but it's also possible that the post-processing is just bringing out the attack of the 808 slightly more. It's hard to tell which is the case. I'm going to add a separate kick layer on a macro for a little extra transient support. To start, load a kick sample on oscillator B. Electronic kick booth sounds pretty close. The 808 is key tracked, but I'm going to keep the kick layer unkey tracked, so it always hits at the exact same pitch. Pitch it to E3, normalize it, and downsample a bit. Sculpt the kick's tone by routing it through a filter, and routing that filter directly out, so as not to get limited and saturated by the FX section. Roll off a touch of high end using the sampler's built-in low-pass filter. Let's add the kick to a macro to easily choose whether we want to use it for any given note. Since we're making this a preset, it might be helpful to have a macro for adjusting the kick's pitch as well. This part's optional. I think we could add a little bit of ringing that feels like it's vaguely audible in the right channel. This sounds like it might be part of the 808, but it's pretty subtle. To add this, create a sine wave and pitch it up 3 octaves. Route it to the FX section. And then mix it in super quietly. And pan it slightly to the right. Of course, with this approach, the ringing will sustain past the end of the 808 sample, and we could fix this. We could mess about a bunch with key-tracked envelopes to solve this, but I don't know if it's really worth the effort since the MIDI notes here never sustain long enough for this to happen. Now, as mentioned earlier, there's a ton of extra distortion and noise on the track, and that needs to live somewhere. Some of the noise coincides with 808 hits, so let's layer some of it into this 808 patch. Set up oscillator 4 with some stereo tape noise. Turn key tracking off and normalize. It might be helpful to control noise level using a macro. Make every note's noise slightly different by routing note on rand to the sample start time, and turn on looping so the noise never cuts out. High pass using the sampler's filter. And bandpass using the other available filter. Route that filter to the FX section so that the noise gets smashed and distorted. It sounds like the noise isn't quite this wide, so we can narrow the noise's width using a utility effect. We'll add the hissing, high-pitched tape noise as part of the synth preset. Now that we've reduced the width a little bit, we can maybe pan the ringing a little farther out. Lastly, automate macro 1 all the way down during the high 808 fills. Okay, let's move on to the synth. At first listen, this just sounds like a really basic saw wave panning back and forth, but there's a lot more to it than that. If we pan a basic saw wave back and forth, this is what we get. It should be pretty clear that this captures none of the vibe of the track. On the track, I hear noise, I hear aliasing from sample rate reduction, I hear reverb. The panning behavior and its interaction with all the elements in the sound is really particular. The decay behavior is really particular. The high notes and the low notes behave a little differently, and there's a ton of distortion in later sections from this crushed master, and also increasing phase interference as the song progresses, which could be from different modulation effects or unison voices or multiple oscillators or something like that. This stuff is where all the vibe is coming from, and a lot of it is sort of random, so matching it's pretty tough, but I've done my best. Let's start by putting the whole session into mono. The panning behavior is just so attention-grabbing, it'll help to negate that for a little bit in order to focus on the other characteristics of the sound. Let's just turn the amp level up, and first set the amp envelope. At the BPM of 144, set attack to a dotted 30-second note with a slope of 0, decay to a half note with a slope of -80, sustain to 40%, and turn decay and release linking on. The MIDI pattern contains velocity information so that the higher right panned notes recede a little bit into the background. To hear this, turn velocity sensitivity all the way up, and adjust the velocity curve in the global tab. Now add a low-pass filter. The MG LP24 will work well, with a resonance of 10, fat all the way up, and frequency somewhere between 5 to 7K. This can route straight to the FX section. Now let's dirty up this saw wave a little bit. After trying a few approaches to distortion, I decided the match came out a bit better by just distorting the wave cycle itself a bit. This is fortunately pretty easy because the first note of the song is just completely exposed and dry. So we can just loop that first note through a frequency analyzer and just paint our waveform one harmonic at a time using the Wavetable Oscillator's FFT editor. To do this, first turn random phase down. And limit polyphony to one voice per note. All of this ensures that every hit's going to be exactly the same, and without that we can't really dependably paint this first note. Just remember to turn random phase back up again after you're done. So select the Wavetable engine and open the Wavetable's FFT editor. Then literally just paint each partial until the gray curve matches the red curve. Just ignore the frequency bump above 10K, we'll add that with Redux in a minute. This wave cycle painting can be done with the volume down to preserve sanity. I'll fast forward this part, and at the end of the FFT painting, this is the dirty saw wave we end up with. Now for some noise, reverb, and vibe. First, degrade the sound with some sample rate reduction. And add some reverb. The convolver setting Ice House seems to work well. Put this in parallel mode and assign convolver mix to a macro. Then add some pitch modulation and detune effects. To me it sounds pretty close with a bit of flanger and tape warble. And while we don't need this for the song, adding some noise reduction to a macro is useful for this preset. For a more analog noise sound, we can add a high-frequency phaser sweep. And lastly, focus the tone more in the upper mid-range. Okay, there's no need to be exactly perfect at this point until we dial in the panning, because that's going to change some things as well. So this is close enough, and we can switch focus over to the panning and imaging. So let's switch back to stereo. So the main thing that stands out after switching to stereo is that our noise is really wide, and that's the main reason that I chose to use tape noise instead of a noise sample. It's in stereo and it's not gated by the amp envelope, so it's just consistently layered over the entire plugin, which is exactly what I hear on the track. So now let's dial in the panning behavior. Start by panning the oscillator to where the leftmost notes seem to live. And then modulate panning with an LFO to where the rightmost notes seem to live. It's not exactly symmetrical. The rightmost notes are a little bit closer to the center than the leftmost notes are. I hear another type of noise here that's responsive to the panning behavior, unlike the tape noise, which just hisses consistently across the stereo field. So to achieve this, open a sampler and set it to stereo white HP1. Normalize and turn off the noise oscillator's key tracking. Match its panning behavior to that of the main oscillator. And add both pan modulations to a macro so they can both be controlled more easily. Loop the sample, and high-pass the noise around 7K using the sampler's built-in filter. And now that we're in stereo, there are a few other stereo effects parameters that sound like they need adjustment. The reverb should be narrower and panned more to the right. This helps offset the leftward leaning pan. Also, inverting the right channel of the flanger seems to smear the imaging a little less, preserving the definition of the panning better. Now, it would be nice if the sound just remained the same during the whole track, but it takes on a different character after the intro and seems to morph a bit in different sections. And some of this could just be down to how it's interacting with the master limiter, getting squashed every time the 808 hits and so forth. But we're going to try to print as much of the vibe into the preset as we can.
Okay.
So let's create a macro that changes a bunch of these things simultaneously, and we can turn that up after the intro ends. So automate macro 1 up after the intro. This will control most of the things that change after the intro finishes. Then automate the channel's volume lower for the rest of the song. And automate both the panning and reverb macros down just slightly. They're at 100% now. Feels a little better around 80% for the rest of the song. As the song progresses, these chorusy, phasey interactions seem to get a little bit more pronounced. And to capture this, I'm going to use macro 1 to make the flanger more pronounced, create more tape warble, and add some unison detune. Also macro down tape noise slightly. And macro down the downsampling, which helps make space for the hi-hats. There's still more mid-range thickness and phase interaction needed, especially in later sections of the song. To achieve this, duplicate oscillator 1 and tune the duplicate up a perfect fifth. Then automate this layer's level in your DAW. Let's reorganize the oscillators first. And it sounds best to me with the levels set about like this. Use macro 1 to add back some of this boxy mid-range. And now some more distortion. A touch of FX filter distortion helps a little bit. So add that to macro 1. Now for all the really big distortion and pumping. This is pretty clearly not on the track itself, on the original, but it's coming from this just really aggressive limiting. I tried a bunch of distortions out, but because of the unique quality of the reference track, there's just really no replacement for just some really gross over-the-top limiting. This works better outside of the synth because then we can chain it to the 808. I'm using Pro L2 for this, but you can use any limiter you want. Just absolutely smash it until it distorts a ton. And automate this to unbypass after the intro finishes. Now with everything playing back together, we're still missing a little bit of noise, but that's okay because we already created it on the 808. I think we just need to crank it up now.
Kept whipping round and wearing me pockets filled with 20 boots and GBP that's stealing. Gas that I'm slide I can never be.
Yeah, that's better.
Kept leren, kept whipping round and wearing me.
Awesome, that's 4 Raws by EsDeeKid. Check the link in the description below to download the free presets. Hope you found it helpful. Cheers.